Welcome everyone to session 2 of Purposeful Communications and Advocacy on Water. We're excited to have everyone here. I'm Katie Hefner. I'm coming to you from WARE's Center for Behavior and the Environment. I'm going to be our moderator for today. And to kick things off, before we dive real in, I want to invite Angel Cardenas to the stage. He is Manager of Urban Development at CAF, and I look forward to hearing his thoughts. Thank you. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and I think more importantly, I'm the manager of urban development and water. That would absolutely. In order to get into this session, and I was just reading on the screen, and I think it's an important question. It's like how to build trust for sustainable water services or for sustainable water for the future. And we were joking internally that, a bunch of engineers and economists have a hard time trying to understand the value and importance of the concept. But as we worked through this session in the last couple of months, I think we realized not only how important but relevant this concept is. Building trust in terms of providing, legitimate and effective water services is key if we want to move forward in this agenda. So that would probably be my most important idea that I want to share with you. Having said that, I'm going to skip to the script of my team this time, and I'm not going to improvise. They're looking at me like, again, you're talking whatever you want to do. So I think we all know water and sanitation service access is a human right, and in order and this implies that we have to move towards universality of services, and this is essential for human development. But it also means that these services should be provided in conditions of accessibility, continuity, good quality for human consumption, and probably most important, affordable rates, particularly for the vulnerable populations. For this reason, guaranteeing safe water and sanitation services also implies, and again, going back to the trust part, having channels of interaction with citizens. And this interaction should have at least two characteristics. One of them is they have to be legitimate. Legitimacy is a key component, and effective. So effectiveness is also important. And in order to have those, this interaction should promote participation, transparency, and more importantly, timely accountability. Legitimacy is essential to build trust. The pandemic, that it might seem far, but it just happened 2 years ago, left us many lessons. Those who did best were those governments that combined public trust, and they were able to sell what their previous actions were. Good use of technology, they have tools to communicate, to better communicate, and good leadership, personal communication. In all organizations, trust is always relevant to establish effective communication. And in the water sector, it's especially sensitive due to its social connotation. Again, it's a human right. Trust generates conviction, particularly in what you do or not, because of achieving the greater good and the social welfare. Water resources management requires effectiveness in providing good services as well as cooperation. And cooperation is a key word when we talk about this, between people and institutions. Building and maintaining trust can lead to healthier relationships, conflict resolution, and more important, a greater willingness to communicate and new opportunities for collaboration. The advantages of trust do not only apply to personal relationships that we all might be aware of, but they are also visible between organizations and social groups that allows public good campaigns with greater penetration and impact. Trust comes with transparency, and water sector organizations, regulators and water utilities should provide information with openness and credibility. So in the event of service interruption or rate increases, or any disruptive event, society is duly informed. Transparency and credibility in the stewardship of services are key. In this sense, it's essential to combat fake news, the impact on social networks and traditional media. Explaining to the public through the simple, honest, and transparent communication brings trust. Engagement and dialogue with the stakeholders can lead to a better decision-making, as well as gaining support to decisions made, ensuring adequate water quantity and quality in the long term. Based on the above, innovative technologies and collaborative management can not only facilitate a problem solving, but also introduce important means to ensure the sustainability of solutions with the support of all parties involved. I welcome this session to address the issue of trust, basis for managing sustainable services. Thank you again for the opportunity. Have a great day.
Thank you, Angel. So, like I said, I'm Katie Hefner. I'm coming to you from Rare Center for Behavior and the Environment. And as we dive into the session, I just want to kick it off with a little bit of framing. So, if you've heard our talks before, you've heard that every conservation and sustainability challenge has one thing in common. And what that really comes down to is to successfully address them, we need to change someone's behavior. We need someone somewhere to do something differently. Now, that's especially true of water challenges, whether that's switching to organic fertilizers, whether that's restoring a stream bank, whether that's reducing water usage, whether that's properly managing waste. All of these things require behavior change. Now, to achieve the outcomes that we need to see and we want to see, that means that we have to develop behavioral solutions. Now, at our Center for Behavior and the Environment, you may have seen we have lots of resources around individual behavior change. We have a system with the levers of behavior change. We have processes in behavior-centered design for how to create the solutions that leverage behavioral science and social sciences. The challenge that we're focused on with water as well is not only do we need individual behavior change, so too we also need cooperation. We need collective action. And because managing water requires cooperation among individuals and requires cooperation among institutions. And while one person might be better off using a little extra water during a drought or dumping their waste to avoid treatment, if everyone does this, the community and the environment is worse off. And so motivating people to positively act in the way that we want to see actually requires us to have their actions complemented by their peers. And so one thing that I want to walk through today as we get started in today's session is around this theory of cooperative behavior adoption, for how to think about cooperative dilemmas and how collective action challenges are really some of the things that we have to address to be successful in the water sector. So there are 3 stages to this collective cooperative behavior adoption challenge. I'm going to walk through them right now kind of quickly. So the first stage is phase 1, which is generating collective demand. Now, for a community to collectively change their demand, it means that members of the community hold 2 beliefs. First, they believe that everyone should change their behavior because it's the right thing to do. And second, they believe that everyone else in their community believes that they should change their behavior because it's the right thing to do. And while this is collectively changing this demand is the first step to addressing a challenge, it's often insufficient alone at resulting in behavior change. And this is because even if people want to change, they're only willing to change if everyone else is willing to change as well. And the challenge here is that this is often where organizations stop. We believe that if we raise awareness, we get people to support or agree to our efforts, that that's going to lead to behavior change. And awareness is not equal to action. In fact, it does not always lead to the behaviors that we want to see, but it can be a critical step. So I just wanted to stop for a second and ask the group. So how many of you know that you need to exercise or eat healthier? Pretty much everyone, right? How many of you want to exercise and eat healthier, right? We all want to do this. How many of you are actually exercising and eating healthier every day? How many of you exercised yesterday? I'm impressed. It's not easy to exercise this, but if your success at exercising and eating healthier also relied on everyone else in this room exercising and eating healthier, that might change as well, right? And so how do we motivate this collective action challenge? So this phase 1 is a precursor to change, but it really is not enough at getting us to where we need to be. So the second stage of this challenge in the behavior change process is coordinating the shift. How do we get everyone to shift at once? Now, coordination can be achieved if all of the members come to the conclusion that everyone around them will be changing their behavior at the same time. So changing the belief with phase one and their selective demand or collective demand from phase one, the community will start to change their behavior if we can get this shift happening. Now, it's unstable though. This new norm is unstable, and any shock that happens to the new norm can revert us back to the uncooperative behavior and the unsustainable one. And so what we really need to do is reinforce it in some way. And there's ways to reinforce this belief. One that has worked well within RARE's programs. RARE is an international conservation organization that I come from. We've seen success here. There's also research and science, some done by SIWI and others, that look in the power of public commitments. So how can we reinforce this, I think you will, this coordinating the shift, making a commitment that others know about, that others can hold you accountable to, that everyone in this room is curious if you're going to exercise or eat healthy because your success impacts our success. This momentum for action, though, is fragile. And so how do we reinforce and sustain it? And that's what we're going to talk about next, which is phase three, which is strengthening the norm. And for this new norm to stick, we need to move into this final phase. And these activities that strengthen the norm can lead community members to the final beliefs that if they were to violate the norm, other people would find out, and other people would not accept an excuse for why they violated the norm. So there's ways you can eliminate excuses. You can make behaviors observable. You can make it so that other people know that if I break my commitment, if I'm dumping my waste, if I'm over-fertilizing, using water too much, that other people will find out. You can use enforcement mechanisms. You can also use policy reform here to strengthen the norm, to reinforce and stabilize what you have done with the shift. Now, the keys to all of this, you've probably heard throughout, are, sorry, I'm gonna go ahead one more, are trust and communication, which is why we are here and why this topic is in the Purposeful Communications session. Building and maintaining trust can lead to healthier relationships. It can lead to conflict resolution. It can lead to greater willingness to communicate and opportunities for collaboration. The advantages of trust aren't just for personal relationships. You can see it between organizations, between societal groups, and trust is crucial when we're handling environmental challenges. So during this session, we're going to be sharing some of the science behind trust, some of the science behind communications, as well as some case studies for how to do this. So before I turn it over to our speakers to join in, there's two pieces that I wanted to just give a few quick plugs. If you're interested in learning more about behavioral science specifically and cooperative challenges, we have two upcoming opportunities, one on our platform called behavior.rare.org, and then one is a webinar discussion on cooperative challenges and how to manage cooperative behavior change. So I encourage all of you, if you are interested, to learn more. And finally, we also have this platform, behavior.rare.org, where over 3,000 people have joined with free resources completely available on how to manage individual and cooperative change. So now that I've made my communications team happy and they've seen this, I want to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Ganga Sridhar. Ganga is an assistant professor of behavioral science at the London School of Economics Department of Psychological and Behavioral Sciences, and she's a co-director of the behavioral science program. She is an applied behavioral and experimental economist studying how to change human behavior in ways that benefit people and the planet. Her research examines how people perceive and understand complex dilemmas such as mass extinction, climate change, consumer and citizen motivations, and choices. To keep things moving, right after Ganga, we'll also have Lama Ranjus. Lama's studying the role of transparency and truth in a digital age and how this fits with human rights and environmental resource management. So please welcome Ganga to the stage and later Lama. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie, for that wonderful introduction and setting the stage perfectly. So good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to think about trust for a little bit and give you some examples from my research about how misinformation or multiple conflicting types of information often, which is what we often deal with, is we're immersed in information-rich environments, and they can often give us very conflicting signals about what to do. So I kind of want to look at that issue a bit, and then in the second part, after we go through a couple of case studies, I look at some ways to nudge ourselves into learning to decipher it. Right. So I think Katie perfectly set the stage in the sense like water management is a cooperation dilemma. And the reason we say that is because it's a shared good. So how you use water affects how other people use water, even if you're very physically distant from them. And a classic case example of this is, say, something like ocean pollution or global warming, right? And not just that, there's often this trade-off potentially between the short-term interests to act for the individual and the long-term interest for the collective. So an example of this is it takes a bit of effort for me to, use a more eco-friendly, shower head, right? And reduce my consumption a little bit. But that personal cost is something I bear in the short run. Whereas that could be shared more widely in terms of the benefit, in terms of saved water by everybody, right? So traditionally, we've got this collective action dilemma framework to think about how to incentivize people to act more pro-socially in order to act in ways that actually favor the collective and therefore cooperate with each other. This can be kind of tempting because we might not always think about everybody else. We're inattentive, we're forgetful, we're often overworked, right? We're tired. And not just that, we might favor people who we are closer to, our in-group. So there's multiple ways we've actually figured out norms of cooperation which can influence our choices, not just in the context of very overtly cooperative choices like making a donation or helping someone who's hurt, but also in slightly more cloaked ways, for instance, water use. Right? And the key thing here is trust, as Katie said, which relies on expectations we have over other people's behavior. If we expect people to act in their self-interest, then we're going to be more likely ourselves to not do the thing to maximize the collective goal, right? And this can, of course, depend on the information we have about what other people do, our perceptions of them, but also the environments that they act in, right? And norms. So I think trust here is, I'm gonna basically jump over this, but an example of something where I think trust and norms really matters, for instance, how we split something. A cooperation norm in a case is to split something equally, say 50-50, if it's between two people. And of course, that can be quite culturally specific, right? In some places, it might be that depending on if you earned that particular thing that you're sharing, you might actually there might be norms to keep some of it and only share 40%, right? So these sorts of norms about fairness, reciprocity, trust, and in terms of actually how that determines your behavior really do matter. Right? So what is trust? Very quickly, I thought it's just worth reiterating. It's the degree to which a party feels they can depend on another party to do what they say they think they'll do. Right? This doesn't mean that they have to do the right thing morally or even have the right motivation. It's really a question of actually, will they do what they say they're going to do? Are they credible? Are they legitimate? I think you brought that up in the beginning for the first talk. So do they have legitimacy, etc.? And of course, this depends on what you can observe. That can be text information, what you see in the newspaper, but it can also be your own personal experience of this. So an example of this, I was telling Katie, was I went wild swimming last month in the UK, and there's been a lot of news about the sewage in the water. And, I could literally feel a part of my body being like, I can experience the lack of investment in, say, the water system, right? Apart from reading about it in the paper. And therefore, having that information environment where I'm reading about it all the time and immersed in it, I can actually tactile feel it. Really, it's those sorts of informational cues which will, say, influence whether I trust the water sector to actually give me clean water. Is it drinkable water? Is it potable water? Can I go swimming in it? Is it safe? Right? And therefore, this trust factor is really important, both because of the information we see in our media environment, but also our personal experiences. Another way of thinking about trust is actually to trust someone or something. So we'd want to expect particular actors to act in a way that's legitimate, consistent, and in line with what we expect, and therefore we trust them. So you can imagine that we might have systematically different expectations, norms and relationships to different actors. In the water sector, for instance, I might trust my husband to do something a particular way at home. The length of the shower, will he actually water the plants when he says he would? So I have these sorts of expectations, and I trust him to potentially not do that at the moment, right? But I might trust water sector to do something else, right? Like my supplier, Thames Water, there's been a lot of news and coverage about them recently in the UK. So do I have expectations that every time I turn on the tap, the water will be clean enough for me to drink, right? So I have that trust over them. I might have a trust over the regulator. say, of what? Will they actually be trustworthy enough for them to regulate the companies in ways they said they would? Are they going to check compliance? Are they going to fine companies for bad behavior? That's an example of trust I place on a regulator. Finally, I might just trust you guys to be, cooperative to address climate change, to think about water when you go back after this conference, to do something that fundamentally changes the way you're addressing and understanding this issue. So I think this is really key. So when we're thinking about trust, we're thinking about not just, do I trust the information available? That is the content of the message. It's also about, who do I trust? Am I trusting the source of the message? So do I trust this particular newspaper? Do I trust this particular party which is involved in providing water to us? And so on, right? And it's this combination of the information content, which can include things like the facts in the information, the frame, right? But also who is providing that information, the messenger. So it's the message and the messenger, which often determines whether we act in cooperative ways in pro-environmental settings. So I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to show you some figures. Forget about the figures. The main thing I want you to think about in this figure is this is a review of, say, around 46 to 50 studies on pro-environmental behavior and trust. And there are two main findings, right? The first thing I would like to draw to your attention is basically the environmental groups and scientists, which is basically the third and the last bars. They're sort of on average higher than, say, general trust, institutions, and industry. So what this chart essentially tried to do was see how much people trust different people in relation to climate change and pro-environmental behavior, and whether that trust predicts or is associated with, not causally, but correlationally, pro-environmental actions. And the paper found that, yes, it is, especially when you think about the trust people place on environmental groups and scientists. Those are more trusted groups in the context of environmental behavior, as you would expect. And actually that increased trust influences how likely they are to report taking particular actions on their lives, as well as supporting particular policies. The only time actually we find that trust in industry and government and stuff matters here in this study, and this is all associations, is when it comes to public sphere actions like support for taxes or support for regulation. So if you distrust your government, you're more likely to oppose any policies that, say, curtail your freedoms or levy some cost on you. An example of this across the world is things like water pricing charges, which often are hotly debated by the public, right? But if you trust your government more, you're more likely to believe that, okay, this is probably coming from the right place. And the same thing for industry as well. So this sort of tries to highlight that trust not just matters for the actions we take, but also the attitudes and our openness to supporting particular policies. Misinformation can really damage trust. So, for instance, there was an infodemic declaration by the WHO in the context of COVID. This was a time where all of us was stuck at home, isolated from each other, and we had to rely on information which was very difficult to verify, and was also quite fast evolving, right? So you'd had, for instance, the first way COVID was thought to be transmitted was through droplets, and then it became through air, right? So in that sense, you had a fast evolving scientific environment with some scientific uncertainty. So if people tend to trust scientists for things that they're quite aware of, what about when there is uncertainty in the science, right? And that's really what we saw. And we found that people normally trust sources they already trust. So newspapers you already rely on, friends networks you already rely on, or things you firmly believe which are associated, right? So if I believe in a particular political viewpoint, I might trust the science because someone with a particular viewpoint I believe in has endorsed it. And this is kind of a bit what we try to study in my research when we were looking at the multiple COVID-19 origin stories, right? There was one story that this is really just from animals, so it was a zoonotic spillover. It was an animal virus which jumped. There was a second story pushed by a lot of international organizations as well as scientists saying that actually when you have widespread destruction of nature, there's greater interaction and therefore the chance for zoonotic spillovers are greater. So this is an example of a proximate and a distal source. And the third one, of course, was a completely different source, a counter narrative, that it was manufactured in a lab and this basically was a result of a lab leak. So we found that when you have three different stories, one which mentions just animals, one which mention animals and human action, and a third which mentions all three, including the counter narrative, It's only the second story, which attributes responsibility to humans, that increases support for conservation policy and wildlife regulation policy. The moment you have multiple information sources, if they're conflicting, even if they're not well referenced by any evidence, even when that is not communicated, people tend to diffuse support. So what we actually found was in story 1 and 3, people didn't tend to think it was important to regulate and conserve biodiversity and address climate change. So this is an example of how multiple conflicting sources can actually diffuse support. And this is often the case when you've got misinformation and disinformation. So not just is support diffused, this can also have an effect on trust, because it creates the source of uncertainty, which is when people sort of rely more on sources they feel safe with, rely increasingly on conspiracy theories if they're supported by those sources they feel safe in. And this is kind of one of the key things here. I'm going to jump through this and basically just focus on this. This is some data we collected last year based on the UK, and what we found was people are more likely to support transformative policy change, which we do need for things like the Sustainable Development Goals and so on, and it has been fully pushed recently by both the IPCC, the IPBES, but also the UN Sustainable Development Goal agenda, is that if you perceive scientists disagree, similar to if you perceive there are multiple sources or arguments for why the world is the way it is, you are less likely to support these policies. So this idea of disagreement and consensus is very interesting, especially in the water sector when things are not directly observable, right? We have to rely a lot on experts. You have to rely on your water companies. You have to rely on your regulator to tell you the water quality is good. And if you don't trust that or you perceive there's disagreement, this is often going to diffuse your support for policy. And not just diffuse your support because people get confused, but also because maybe they experience other emotions like anger. So forget the main reason for showing you this complicated figure is because I wanted you to think about what happened in the Ireland case, where they tried to introduce water pricing in 2014-15. This fantastic paper actually by some scholars at University College Dublin essentially found there was a lot of anger targeted towards the regulator because water was perceived as a right, and therefore this incurred a lot of protest against the water charge, right? And the way this operated was through this negative emotion of anger, which is often the case when you have a big policy change or introduce pricing or want to introduce a new policy. So the paper basically found that when you had a more positive response to the government, that increased support and policy acceptance, but when you had negative emotions, what happened was anger increased your expected costs of the policy. So you overweighted how expensive the policy would be for you, and that reduced your policy acceptance, right? Anger is a very important emotion. It can be used for a lot of social justice as well. And in this case, if people's values are opposed to the policy, for instance, if they perceive it's a right, you're likely to experience that sort of anger as well. And this is often the case when you've got fairness issues with trust and water, right? So for instance, I've been mentioning this recently, but there's a lot of coverage in the UK for now. In one of the richest countries in the world, can you trust the water that we're actually drinking? Can you trust the water that we're actually drinking? But not just that, can you trust the people responsible for the quality to do the right thing, right? And when you've got this multiple sources of information, misinformation, and even disinformation, that actually the water quality is good, actually the water quality is bad, in the wake of regulators not doing enough. So for instance, I know there's a movement called Surface Against Sewage. Individuals are volunteering water quality data. So there's a sort of citizen science approach to this because there's basically less from the environmental agency. Basically, the idea would be that we need to think about how to harness that mistrust and address it. And that's what we're going to do the next to rebuild trust.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? So I hope that you all got your morning coffee before the session, because I think we are giving you academic overdose and a lot of things to think about. I will continue what Dr. Ganga was speaking about, and basically also ask some questions, philosophical questions, maybe that's why you need your coffee. And then my presentation will basically just thought-provoking and think about what we already know and what we might not know in the context of water corporation. So let's start with some questions. Sorry. And this question, I will bring it back to the room. So I would like to ask you to think about what factors can impact your level of trust in the information that you receive. You're all probably coming from the water sector, maybe scientists, or coming from also political science background. And you all have maybe an idea about what make you trust kind of information. So just take a moment and think about when you read the newspaper, when you see or hear the news, or if you just received read a Facebook post or Twitter, visit some tweets, what makes you trust this information that you're receiving? And the second question is, what constitutes truth for you and your community? We'll just take a moment to think and then move forward. So when we start this session today with Mr. Cardenas, he actually pointed out that trust comes with transparency. And this is really a strong statement, and I would say that I would agree 95% with it. However, we need to also consider a few aspects of this statement. And I also need to state with a disclaimer that what I will say is not my own opinion, but opinions of other people out there that thinks that transparency actually cannot be maybe useful for the all context when it comes to building trust. For example, philosopher Aurora O'Neill, she thinks that actually transparency can lead to deception instead of building trust. She argues that transparency can add to the ways in which the public can be deceived. And she suggests that deception is the real enemy of a trust, and that reducing deception and the lies rather than secrecy is the key to restoring trust. So I will just give also examples that started with Katie today, talking about the exercise and healthy habits. We usually also want to be transparent in front of others and present ourselves. Too much transparency that can lead to us to state statements or say things that we don't really do as in our daily activities. That might lead us to deceive others because we feel the pressure of what we want to present or how we want to be presented to others. And in water sector, that also can be considered or led to bad or negative point of views when it comes to sensitive political situation. And here really want to talk about the context of where transparency can be not really received as a good thing. When we have political tension between different parties, that transparency can lead to issues more than solutions. Also, when we talk about transparency, when we have different parties have different level of power, when we ask the same parties to share the same all the information that they have without taking into consideration the level of power or the dynamic of power between these actors. Also, when we think about transparency without any legal framework, we just ask for transparency, we ask for sharing information without any or thinking about how we can regulate this sharing of information between parties having shared water or want to work on water cooperation. And I'm sure that in the room you will have many examples from your work about cases where transparency didn't really lead to the positive impact that we wish that it should be led to. Also, I want to lead it to the misinformation and trust in the digital age. Also, Dr. Gang talked about that we have a lot of information flow. We have flood of information, actually. And we don't have a big issue of transparency because we have access to social media. We have a lot of parties and stakeholders reducing this mass information. But what is important to think about on how this information can be verified and understood by the general public. Also, we don't really think about the privacy concerns and the data security. That's an issue that comes with when we ask about access to information and what kind of information that we need to share with other party. We also think that everyone will use this information in a good way, even though there is also bad parties that want to use this information for their agenda or for fueling conflict instead of building peace, especially when it comes to the water sector. And we have also a few examples of that. There are some recommendations that can be helpful to balance transparency and trust. For example, we have access to information, but we need to also place a question about who doesn't really still have access to this information. Who are the community that we need to think about when we sharing information and want to receive information from. Also, it's really important to think about the ethical questions. It is difficult questions, and it might make our work really harder, but it's really important to ask. We discussed also the legal frameworks and how the data sharing should be managed between different actors. And that's also need to be addressed when we are talking about balancing transparency. It's very important also to understand who's leading the discussions, or who's presenting this information, or who's giving the truth to the communities addressed. And that's also something that discussed by Dr. Ganga. From a very academic point of view, we need to accept that we don't have or hold the whole truth. We might hold 99% or 95%, but we still don't have the whole truth. And it's really good to start from that point of view when we are discussing sharing information and building trust. That usually comes from our expertise, holding our academic knowledge, our experience, and we think that we know the right things for a different context, but it is very important to start from the point that we might not hold the whole truth. And it is for that is very important in the digital age that we have or understand if there is any problem with the community that we are dealing with, or the cases that we are discussing water cooperation with, that they do all have the access to similar information that we hold as well, by enhancing media literacy or even give more accessibility to digital technologies. Also, it is important to take into consideration the social and political factors and support fact-checking initiatives. These are all recommendations. I also need to disclaim that comes from a different session during the World Water Week. I attended a couple of sessions, and kind of lessons learned or the main thoughts that were addressed about transparency and building trust. And I come back to you with this question. I hope that you thought about the first two questions in the beginning of this session. And I would like to ask you about if you have any experience or perspective that maybe agree with this point of view or disagree with it, just to be critical about it as well. And what are some challenges and benefits of transparency in various contexts that can be addressed today? So I would really love to hear from you, more than hearing from me. So if you have any examples that can support this argument or give a counter argument. I think you need the morning coffee. Anyone in the room?
So first, I'll confess that if there's like crickets in a room, I feel a terrible pressure to be the one to raise their hand. But I also like to try to defer to others. So if anyone else wants to ask the first question, please go for it. Alrighty. That was a question. And I haven't had enough coffee either. So I guess I have one, it's a pretty fundamental question to the hypothesis about, transparency versus disinformation. And so I guess my question is, it's not really transparency if you're presenting disinformation in your expression of transparency, right? So so how do we, if we're pushing transparency or if we're saying transparency isn't the avenue towards the resolution of disputes or getting proper information out there, then I think that there might be some consideration of defining transparency more clearly, because I think a lot of people respond to transparency to mean exactly that, like to present, information and your source of information fully and completely, but not exaggerated. So that was sort of a tension point while I was listening. So that's one comment. And then I guess the second is really related to, maybe it's because I'm from America, but when you put three different sources up there and people turn to one or the other, it's very difficult to break through that, especially when there's two very, bifurcated sources. And so people just only have two places to go, so they'll lean. And so in that context, do you have any suggestions for advocacy groups, if that's what I am, or anybody, to how to break that impasse?
Another question? Question or also, given examples.
It's a concrete example on that first point. So I was working for the city of Cape Town the last few years, and I'm going to make some comments later on about the day zero experience and the water quality side and all of that. But what was very difficult for me in this transparency discussion was on the seawater quality and the river water quality that Dr. Ganga alluded to in the UK. So there was a big push to publish our seawater quality data, but when you actually try and make sense of it, the more data you have, the less you really know what the trends are. You can take a sample, anywhere, and a few seconds later, it's going to give you a different E. coli reading or whichever you're measuring. And it's not to say that you can't make concrete claims about seawater quality being, appropriate for bathing or for swimming or for recreation or something else, but interpretation is really more useful for the public. So, we were pressurized to put the data in the public domain. It ended up making a lot more opportunity for the public to comment, but the most useful thing was actually advocacy groups or groups like the Blue Flag, which is just an NGO and not very scientific, who had a trusted brand to say, on balance, we think that this is safe for swimming. But you have this tension between how much data you put out there, what interpretation is useful, and how to manage that kind of data environment in that space.
Thank you so much, and I wish we had more time, but we ran out of time. I will definitely go back to your question, but mainly I really wanted from this presentation to be thought-provoking, as I mentioned. And when we think about transparency, might be it's really the easy to go to. It's like, okay, let's share the information without considering the context, which is very important. And we need always, when we are thinking about solution of and water cooperation, to think about the context where we are doing this work with. Because in some cases, that transparency cannot lead to the right results that we need. Also, asking the difficult questions can save money, time, and energy. And in that very context, that we sometimes tend to, we know the solution and that's it, but we don't question our knowledge or what we might missed from the solution that we are providing. Either it's if we want to change the behavior of the community that we want to intervene in, or if we want to provide innovative solutions for different contexts in that regards. Also, innovation could sometimes mean to take the longest path, meaning that it is easy to share information. Now we have really accessibility for a lot of platforms that share information, but maybe the solution is not always seems to just share the information. Is more, maybe we need to think about science communication and other tools that can take longer time, but can be effective for the communities. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to continue the discussion afterward. Thank you.
All right, I'm sorry I was the bad guy to push things along, but as moderator, it is my job to keep things moving. So in the moment, we're now going to jump into 3 case studies to talk through how people have worked through these concepts of trust, communication, transparency, all of these things in real-world contexts. So first up, we will have Friso Klapwijk, who's Global Director at Wavin, as well as an aquapreneur who transformed urban flat roofs into multifunctional green spaces. After that, we'll have Franz Rojas, Director of Water and Sanitation Analysis at CAF, who's worked on water challenges all across Latin America, to share some of his experiences. And finally, we'll have Michael John Webster, who's a program manager at the World Bank, who oversees 2030 WRG, which is a multi-donor trust fund that works with the public and private sectors. So please join me in welcoming them as we move through some of these case studies.
Good morning. I'm just looking at my slide deck and I'm wondering, I think I missed 2 slides. So, that's what I do. I'm flexible as a host. So let's. No, my name is Friso Klapwijk indeed, and I represent a company, Wavin, which is part of a bigger company called Orbia. And I gave my presentation the title, How to Build Trust for a Sustainable Water Future If Everyone Thinks Your Plan is Crazy. So in 2010, I founded a company, or actually I co-founded a company called the Rooftop Doctors, or in Dutch, the Dak Doctors, which aim to build roof gardens, design and build roof gardens. So I was on rooftops day on, day out, visiting clients, discussing what can be done, what kind of beautiful designs we could come up with. And every time I was on those rooftops, I saw the drainage system. Every flat roof is connected to a drain that ends up in a sewer. And then we were building these beautiful roof gardens. And what we started to do is implement irrigation systems. So on Monday it rained, and on Tuesday we put on the irrigation system because all the water had run off the rooftop into the sewer and was gone. No reuse of water whatsoever. So in 2011, a big rainstorm hit Copenhagen, which caused $1 billion in damage, and that stirred up the conversation also in Amsterdam, like, could such a rain event happen also in Amsterdam? And rain even more was like perceived as a problem, as something we needed to fight, something we needed to oppose. And that's when we had a conference early 2013 that talked about this subject on stormwater in the city of Amsterdam. Conversations like, could such a rainstorm as in Copenhagen also hit Amsterdam? And the answer was yes. And then the question was, are we ready? Well, many slides later, the answer was, no, we're not. And then the answer was posed to the audience, or a round table, what are we going to do? Do we have the solutions in-house? And I was an entrepreneur, so I raised my hand and I said, well, what about roof gardens? And I was almost kicked out of the room because there were a lot of civil engineers thinking cubic meters and outflow rates, and green roofs have been around for quite some time, but are not a hydrological, really, sane solution. So I went home, went to bed at night, woke up, my wife said, what are you going to do? I think I need to sketch something. So I draw something, and a really simple concept, like, what if we would create a void on the rooftop and then control the outflow? Then I have a civil engineering solution. So the next morning, I went to the office and talked about it with the team, and they said, it could be a good idea. So one of the smart designers built a simple design sketch, and I went to the city of Amsterdam and I started talking. And then before I knew it, I had a roof, I had 100K to build a pilot of something that was less than just a sketch. But we pulled it off, and we had our first pilot roof in Amsterdam. We called it a polder roof. I will come explain that story later, or not now, but come over once there is coffee. 2013, that first pilot. And then I suddenly found out that what we have built was not in any way commercially sane. So it took me, with my team, a couple of years to, in the end, come up with the next version. That's where my presentation can jump back into my presentation. 2016, we were able to launch let's say, a more commercial viable solution, and we had our first commercial clients. It took me another 3-4 years before Amsterdam, the city of Amsterdam, really took it on, and we started to scale up. Then it came faster and faster. In 2021, we started to become more internationally recognized. That led, in the end, in 2022, to be acquired by Wavin, which is now my current employer. So, long story short, I think there are 4 things that we were able to pull off by challenging the green roof industry. First, since 2013, the whole green roof industry is not only focused on green roofs, but also the concept of a blue-green roof is widely accepted. It's in the UK, the standard, it's in Germany, it's highly recognized in the Netherlands, and now we're, together with Wavin, bringing this also to other places in the world. The second one is that by introducing an active control on the rooftop, we changed the paradigm on rooftops from a static situation with all water running off and irrigation system activating. It is now the standard to think about activated controlled roofs, including a smart irrigation. On rooftops, we had no clue whatever happened. There was no single piece of data. And if you look at a dense cities, almost 50% of the heart and services are rooftops. So if you want to make a change in a city, you cannot go without rooftops. This is what we've put on the agenda, and not only put on the agenda, we're also really adding valuable data to whatever decision-making process we have. And really important, a lot of the conversations were how is the government going to solve our stormwater issue? And with our pulled roof solution, we've brought in the private area, private buildings, into the equation of can we jointly change the way we solve how we cope with stormwater solutions. So this is a little bit of my story, and the thing is, I'm not a scientist, so excuse me if this is more, anecdotic what I share, but there have been, I've given this a lot of thought on what actually happened, because, oh, sorry, that was the wrong button. What we did was basically against all the convictions. The amount of arguments I've heard, you're crazy to want to put water on your roof. It will leak, the roof will collapse, it will stink, there will be mosquitoes. All the arguments I've heard. So the amount of resistance to have that crazy idea to start putting water on your roof, super interesting. And I needed to build trust with every different actor in that whole building process. So after 10 years of working there, I have a couple of lessons that were valuable to me that I deducted from whatever intuitively I've been doing over the last 10 years. And I think the first one is, and this is meant as a little bit of inspiration for you guys. I believe the core is really drive it. It is not a project, it is a mission. If you want to make a change, put your heart in, because that's the only way people will really start to trust you and work for it. The second one is, we tend to talk about resistance a lot in terms of emotional responses. But the thing is, people actually have a very valid point. And especially if you're crazy enough to want to put water on a roof, there is a lot of serious arguments against that. So instead of pushing it into the, oh yeah, this is just a grumpy old man who's not open for innovation, I really, together with my team, started to dig into every single argument that was opposed to storing water on a rooftop and try to solve it. Sometimes with warranty kind of things, but also in trying to really understand and solve it in our technology, or explain it again, maybe in different language. The third one is, and now I'm part of a big company, so we always make these big Excel sheets about attainable markets and how big can this grow. But actually, what you want to do is start with one believer at a time. You need that first client, and that first client, if you do it properly, that will want to shine off. So you will invite his friends, and that will be your early adopters, and from there you will build a crowd. So a lot of also, and the arguments in the water sector are about how we immediately reach everyone. But I believe what we're doing here today in this conference, and with the ripple effects to all the conversations, that's what we need to do, start somewhere. The fourth one is really crucial. As I said, there were many arguments against this solution, so I started to really look for what is the angle. When I talked to the city, to the municipality, I was focusing on stormwater management and how the private area could be part of the equation of stormwater management. When I talked to a developer, I talked about getting more lead points, getting more innovation points. But when I talked to a landscape architect, I talked about passive irrigation. And it was all the same concept, but the angle was so totally different that it really helped for them to open up their minds, like, oh, this really adds to my agenda. And for a roofer, that it opened up a whole new market, which had a little bit of a risk. So he needed to do his work properly, otherwise we had a leakage, but also, wow, he had this really special position in the market. And the last one is, and especially the last years, I have been discussing a lot about a tipping point. I'd never heard of that concept till someone started a Tipping Point Foundation. I was like, oh, wow, what's that? But the concept that there is a certain point in time when things starts to flow. Once you have reached, and some say 20%, some say 21%, I tend to go for the lower number. Once 70% of the people start to believe in it, then suddenly whoosh, it takes off. And that's actually what's happening now with our pole roof. And to understand that it is not necessarily to immediately cover the full cycle of people you can reach, but understand there is a certain point in time when things start to accelerate. So these are my 2 cents of 10 years of working in the water industry on innovation. I hope it was a little bit of inspiration to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here to talk about a case study we have promoted in Latin America in rural water systems. It's related with community mobilization, that it's close related, I would say, with governance. And as part of governance, we understand that trust and other definitions that we have been hearing about legitimacy and others are close related. Let me just start giving a brief introduction of what we have been doing. CAF is a multilateral development bank in Latin America, and we have been supporting many countries. We have 21 countries as shareholders at CAF, and Bolivia is one of them. And we have been supporting the water sector in Bolivia since 2009. And we are the main multilateral funder, and we have different phases of this Mi Agua, My Water, that it's in Bolivia placed, and we provide loans to the national government, and also the government asks local governments to contribute with counterparts, around 20–25%, depending on the governments, and it's based on creation of community-based water systems. The projects are quite simple for engineers because it mostly, we take water intakes from springs or from water wells, and there are elevated water storage tanks and main pipelines going to standpipes, or depending if it's possible and it's not so dispersed, we have water at premises, at households. And we have developed or supported the country with more than 3,000 projects in 10 years. And it's been quite interesting when we talk about trust. I think trust could be, have many definitions, but also a close relation in this case between the government of Bolivia and CAF, because we have developed different phases and it's not binding from each phase to another. So we have, I think, because of the projects we have been working with the government and see the sustainability of these projects, so then we move forward to another phase. What is interesting is that we have gained lessons learned from each phase to another. At the beginning, I would say that in Mi Agua phase 1, we didn't focus most in community mobilization, perhaps more in infrastructure, but we have learned that it's quite important, it's very important to work with the community, with community mobilization, and also to gain legitimacy from the community. So that's why we have been with the focus of increasing coverage in peri-urban and rural areas nationwide. This is essential for the sustainability of projects, the community mobilization, and it relates, as I said, with governance. And governance, in our understanding, has 2 big components: legitimacy and effectiveness. And it builds upon on different characteristics, which would be transparency, accountability, and participation. And it's not my definition, it's a definition from political science, but we believe on that, and that's why we have been working under this framework with these projects, and also to increase resilience in rural projects. Let me start by saying that governance is I would say, a polysemic term, because when I was studying about governance, I found around 30 definitions of governance, and could be more. And it depends when you look for, sometimes it's related to legal norms, some other definitions about processes, and others could be about accountability. So it depends on how you focus, and I'm not going to discuss on the different definitions. But the favor for me is what I found with Hafti in this governance analytical framework, that it relates the actors, I mean the different stakeholders, and also the problem at stakes, or I would start with the problem at stake, the actors, the social norms, which are the games of the games of the rule, and also the processes. And at the end, this interaction goes into an arena, the nodal point, and you try to create governance. And our best definition of governance, I found, it's that it refers to a process. So governance is a process, formal and informal, vertical or horizontal, of interaction and decision-making among the actors involved, and to address a matter of collective interest, which leads to the development of social norms and institutions. I think it reflects that governance is very dynamic. It's not static, and it builds on trust, but also on legitimacy, and also to have effectiveness on the projects or the issue you are dealing, because if you're not effective, so then you can lose trust or belief in what you are doing. And in this case, Niagua started with what we call the factors for success. One is the bottom-up approach, because it was not top-down in the institution, in the Ministry of Water, saying who is going to have the project, but it was built upon the interests of the community. So the communities presented to the local authority, and the local authority presented to the national government the project. And if the project was not built very well, so the government with our loans and our projects try fix the design or the final designs in order to be sustainable and to be complete. So, but this bottom-up approach is very important, and those who are studying or have been working on governance understand that bottom-up approach is the third, I would say, the third wave of public policy, and it's very important to gain legitimacy. So the bottom approach was one of the factors that we have been promoting along with the government. Also the implementing unit nationwide, I mean, to have different offices in different departments and to be close to the community in order to build and also to promote community mobilization. And it was also important that the community mobilization, as we are going to see in the next slide, it was before the project, during the construction, and after the project, and also the capacity strengthening of the community-based water utility. And the definition that the government of Bolivia took it about DESCOM, that it's the acronym of community mobilization in Spanish, it is a planned and participatory process for making decisions regarding water and sanitation and hygiene. And very important, the citizen participation of women, men, young adults, and children in all project-related activities. So it raises population awarenesses about services provided, household rights, and also responsibilities. That's very important because when we talk about community mobilization, it's not only to discuss the technical decision or the technical selection of the project, but also the tariffs to give sustainability. And it's really important in rural communities because as much of you have been working, I've been working in the water sector for more than 30 years, we see that some rural water projects are not sustainable, and after 5-6 years are no longer working because you don't have the tariffs to cover at least the operation and maintenance. So it's very important to discuss about tariffs as part of the community mobilization, and it deals prior to the infrastructure construction, also during the construction and after the construction to revitalize the issues of tariffs. So what the government of Bolivia, with our support, has been doing with the community participation concept, it's before to discuss with the community the technical solution agreement. So when we talk about that, we decide or the government decides with the community, I would say, if they want standpipes, if it's dispersed community, or they want water at premises, but it has more cost, and so it has to be related with tariffs, for instance. And also if the water quality is good or not. So it creates ownership of the community with the project. And I think it's quite important. Also the creation of a social committee control, because some rural areas are so dispersed that it's quite difficult to have a supervisory unit going from the construction. So the community supports with the social control, seeing if the construction is going, following the time frame, and also if they are building according to the project. So I think it helps to the ministry in the follow-up and also the quality of the construction, because they believe in this project and it's part of this social community control. The water-oriented local census, they know who they are, how families are eligible for the project, hopefully most of them, a comprehensive community diagnosis about also the sanitary issues, the hygiene practices and others, and also a baseline survey on wash and nutrition. And during the construction, it's also a social monitoring during construction, hand washing, hygiene and solid waste collection campaigns, and as I said, the tariff agreement. And after the construction, it comes with reality, with the tariffs implementation, and also to deal with the operation costs, and also to deal with the operation and maintenance of our water system that, as I said, it's community-based. So the project also gives advice and trains people with operation and maintenance. So this, when I was, talking about these actions of community participation, it for sure depends on how you communicate and how you relate with the community. So that's why it's closely related what we are discussing here about communication, about trust, about legitimacy, because if community doesn't believe with what they are doing or the project what is doing, so it's very hard to have the ownership that we expect for. So at the end, with this relation with the community mobilization and also strengthening the community-based institution, we create ownership and legitimacy, also share responsibility about the project, and participation and accountability, as I said, is part of the pillars of what we believe is governance. So at the end, just to finalize the implementation of DESCOM, this community mobilization, along with the technical assistance to community-based operators, are linchpins in Bolivia's integral approach to improving water services quality and sustainability. And to finalize, I think we have contributed with these projects to increase the water coverage in rural area of Bolivia from 59% to 69%. Not coming just from all of us, but mainly with this support, and that's why we are still continuing with this project, and we are going to start Miagua Phase 6 in the forthcoming months. Well, thank you very much. Hoping to build trust by not having slides. So you know it won't be too long. My name is Mike Webster. I'm with the 2030 WRG. It's a World Bank Trust Fund. But what I wanted to talk about is the last 5 years I was heading up the Cape Town Water and Sanitation Directorate. And there's so many examples there of how this issue of trust played out in what happened over those 5 years. Many different topics I could talk about. Many have been covered today around tariffs, around water quality, around certain issues. But the key that mostly concerned me, especially in the first few years, as we had this potential day zero issue, was how to get customers, citizens, the whole of the society to trust the city and save water to be able to get over that crisis. So I don't have a lot of content.
and I don't have huge answers to it, but I've got some anecdotes that may be of interest, and I thought I would share them. So we all know government is incompetent and corrupt. So it's a known fact, and in South Africa it's double. For 300 years, especially the last 100, that distrust in government's authenticity or claim to be serving people or claim to be what they are has just gotten worse and worse. And since 94, it's gotten even worse. So you add to that extremely low trust environment, and the water utility is no different to the rest of government. People put national government, provincial government, local government, whatever perception they might have into their prior assumptions around the messages they're hearing. So you put into that very, very low trust environment a crisis of a drought, and the result was chaos. Everyone blaming everyone else. The rich saying it's because we've had this big influx of poor that came from the rural areas and they're using all the water. The poor saying it's the rich that are using water for their gardens and their swimming pools. The municipality saying it's national government that didn't build enough dams. National government saying it's local government that didn't plan well enough, etc., etc. And the result was this dam level that just got lower and lower month by month, and was clearly becoming a crisis. You added to that a mayor who was going under political pressure for a whole set of reasons, some linked to the drought, some not, that had lost confidence in the water department to come up with a solution. And he termed my predecessor Mr. Complicated, because the engineering response to all of this is, look at this graph, look at these rainfall patterns, look at our predictions, we're going to get through this just fine. But the political messaging and the social messaging was not at all acceptable in that political environment. And month by month, we got closer and closer to this possible situation of taps being dry. In a city of 4.7 million people, 660,000 connections, a very capable municipality by all accounts. In fact, I'd done a study prior to that on the 30 largest cities in Africa and their water risks and their water capabilities, and Cape Town had been put in the top right quadrant, a capable, less risky city. Anyway, I joined in the beginning of 2018 as Director of Water and Sanitation and inherited this situation. The key that the city did to turn it around was to start to own the problem. And I think the most important turning point was to actually start to publish the dam levels in the newspaper, on the website, and communicate very broadly that the result of all of our consumption was causing this particular situation, and that none of the big ideas that were floating around, tugging in icebergs or building a desal plant in a couple of months, or any of these quick fixes were going to work, and that the only solution was going to be a collective behavioral change of dramatically reducing demand. The city had to do a lot more than just share the data. We also did a lot of physical demand management, so a lot of leak detection, a lot of fixing of pipes. We installed meters that shut off after a certain amount of liters per day. We also pushed up the tariffs, very unpopular, but it was extremely necessary for any high consumption. Any consumption over 20 cubic meters was charged at 1,000 Rand, about $70 per cubic meter. So extremely, extremely punitive tariffs at the higher end. It meant that if you had a leak in your house and went away for the weekend, you came back to a water bill of R1 million. But together with that was this very extensive communication campaign led by the mayor, led by the councillors, but driven by the department. And it worked. I'm not sure how many came to Cape Town over that period, but the city was flooded with communication around how do you achieve 50 liters per person per day consumption. That translates into one flush of a toilet. The mayor was on TV saying that she would only wash her hair once a week. Hotels said, they'll remove the plugs from the bath, and everyone got into this collective action. And the result was we went from using 1,000 megaliters a day to under 500, a 55% reduction in water use over a 3-year period. It rained, and we built this strategy of becoming water resilient over time, and that was keeping our demand low and building non-surface water sources 300 megaliters a day. But I think the key lessons for me were the following. The first was acknowledging that there was a crisis, providing clear, understandable, simple data on what it is that the crisis was, having a strategy that we had this in hand, that it had to be a dramatic water saving exercise now, and once that is done, we would build a future, more resilient city with all sorts of investments in groundwater and reuse and desal, etc. Reinforcing that plan and that action as often as possible through specific things that happened. As the first borehole was drilled, there'd be a big event. As the water level started to go up, we published that. We had a water dashboard that went out on a weekly basis showing the dam levels and the rainfall and the correlation of all of those, and a lot of communication, and mainly communication from outside the department, communication from the politicians, from the mayor, from NGOs, from media, from civil society, buttressing those messages that this was really a joined up crisis that everyone needed to respond to, and we were also part of that solution. There's many more other anecdotes and there are other situations, but I think we don't have a huge amount of time. I'm happy to have more of a Q&A around it, but I thought I'd just share that one little bit of information. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. As we get near towards the end, I'm going to welcome back up Dr. Ganga Sridhar to talk a little bit more about the behavioral science that underpins what it takes to rebuild trust and what are some of the insights there.
I'm going to keep it super short so we can have more time for questions. So I'll just go through some of the things I had in mind when we talked about behavioral interventions. I'd like to also just stop off with the last speaker. Thank you for identifying the range of things that we need to do to address a collective action problem. It's not just about information or data. That's not where the responsibility stops. It's about consistently coordinating with other people, thinking about price incentives, thinking about communications, involving community, and that's the nature of a collective action issue. It's essentially about working with different people in different ways. And that can use nudges, that can be with price incentives, it can be with communication, it can be bottom-up work with communities, but also top-down work with executives and elected representatives and the whole thing. So with that in mind, I'm going to focus on a very small slice of kind of the informational angles and the behavioral interventions, right? Because I kind of want to basically first say that trust is built through these sorts of repeated interactions which involve multiple players. So apart from actually seeing changes in your real circumstances on the ground through personal experience, this does come with making the right behaviors observable, really having the right incentives and walking the talk, right? So I'm just going to focus now on information per se and look at misinformation. There was a point about disinformation which came up in the question, and I just wanted to sort of clarify. Misinformation is more about facts which might be incorrect, false beliefs. Disinformation is often a campaign with an intent and goal of creating confusion about those facts. So people might unintentionally circulate bad news, and the line, of course, is very slim and it's blurry, but this is the key difference between the two. So recently, the behavioral science literature has talked about immunizing people from misinformation and disinformation. The idea being that when you're able to recognize something as being inconsistent or false or inaccurate, you're more likely to be skeptical about it, and this can happen in one of two ways based on when the intervention is leveraged. For instance, if you have a more preventative sort of intervention, that's called pre-bunking. And the idea there is listen, there's likely, when you had tweets or X or whatever it's called now, you had this little thing saying this has been forwarded many times or this has been contested. They used to do that when they still had a division in the organization which looked at this. That's an example of a pre-bunk where you're saying that, okay, there is something about this information content or the messenger which we need to keep in mind while looking at the information and the message. A debunk is often the more common conventional approach, which is there's a false fact or misinformation out there, and then you sort of debunk that false fact by providing a counter argument. Right, so these are the two broad ways of addressing misinformation/disinformation. So when we think of fact checking and debunking, and a lot of my thoughts here have been informed by Sander van der Linden, who's based at Cambridge, where he's done a lot of work on immunization and misinformation. The idea here is with debunking that you have the facts, lead with them, make it simple, kind of like the previous example in Cape Town, have them reinforced by expert audiences from different sectors. So politicians, when it comes to environmental organizations, your community members, leaders in the city, and so on. Warn people about the myth, right? And then expose the manipulation technique. So it might appear, for instance, that this person says the water is absolutely fine to drink, but this is the counterclaim to that. Or it might be like, that's okay to actually disobey the house pipe ban, but this is the counterclaim to that. And then you have to provide them with a counter argument, and ideally one supported by facts. So something which is often very common, and especially in this environment, is visual communication. So things like actually a picture of the drought area, a picture of the reservoir. It can be much more intuitive to understand and relate to than actually a graph showing the decline in the water of the curves, right? So we've done some work on Facebook with using ways to get people to attend climate information talks, for instance. And we found drought pictures were much more effective, actually, than just pictures of people sitting with a talk, right? So, when you actually make the issue very clear and actually make it clear how people's actions relate to the outcome that they care about. And this is the causal attribution dimension. That helps a lot. Pre-bunking really comes before the fact, right? And this is preemptively forewarning and exposing people to sources of misinformation. So there's a game, I think, there's a climate change game. There's also a fundamentalism game where people are playing this game, and depending on the answers, they get closer and closer drawn into what it would be to be groomed or what it would be to be prepared or given misinformation. And in doing so, the game essentially gets them to identify with increasing expertise a source of false information, right? So that's sort of an example of a forewarning of impending misinformation in a sense, right? Another way to use a pre-bunk would be to say that people often say this, or this individual has circulated these false rumors before, so you must be careful when you're getting information from them again, right? So it could be about a person's character or the source, or it could be about the message itself. And the idea is when you are used to picking up these cues about people as well as the message, or the source as well as the message, you're more likely to recognize those issues in alternative settings as well. So if you're able to pick up what a face news or a deep fake looks like in this setting, you might be able to do it in other settings too. So this is just an example of a pre-bunk we did when it came to climate change. So what we did was, in India, there were big farmers' protests, partly due to the privatization, or they're going to basically reduce things like the subsidies for particular states. So a lot of farmers, it was one of the biggest protests in the country. And it really was polarized in India, where you had quite a lot of people who strongly opposed the protest and some people who supported them. So Greta Thunberg sort of set out this message, completely unrelated. So the debates at the time were mostly about the regulation. It wasn't about climate change. She sort of sent out this tweet saying, we advocate. And basically what we found was people who read her message didn't really pay attention to the message. It was about the balance of the message. Did she suppose or oppose the protest? And people who already opposed the protest were more strongly favoring, not just thought she was bad, so her credibility and legitimacy failed as a messenger, but also they reduced their support for climate change. So what we did was try to see can these unintended consequences or sort of informational interventions like this be mitigated through something like a pre-bunk? So we sort of clarified her values up front. We said she's done a lot on cooperative action, collective change, especially with young people. And we found that that pre-bunk made people more open to her work, but it didn't necessarily affect what their perceptions of climate change were because of the result of that exposure to the tweet. This is more a cautionary note to just say that information interventions need to be supported by infrastructure policy change, and they are not enough, but they can be promising in some cases. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Ganga, and thank you to all of our speakers. I think we have just hit 10:30, which is the end time, and I think you will join me in saying that this was a fascinating look at all of the content and all of the examples and science that our speakers shared. If you have questions, I know we do not now have time to have them on stage, but please feel free. I'm going to ask our speakers to hang out for maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes if they can over here. And if people have questions in the room, please join us over here. I'm happy to discuss a little bit further. But thank you everyone for coming. I hope you will all join us later this afternoon for our third session in our series of purposeful communications and advocacy on water. So thank you, and best of time in the rest of the World Water Week sessions. Thank you so much.